Today we're talking Craftworld Eldar, so bring out your Aspect Warriors, Wraith Constructs and Grav Tanks, because we're going to talk through every unit that the Asuryani can bring to bear. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Eldar, and I thought that with all the changes that have happened to the Eldar Codex over the past 6 months or so, it'd be well worth revisiting them with a look at each and every unit in turn, talk through some of the strengths and weaknesses of each, and a rough score out of 10 for how strong I'd rank them in game at the moment. The Craftworlds were performing very strongly when their codex first came out, though have taken a few nerfs since. They have been performing a bit in Nephilim at tournaments and things, but they do strike me as a bit of a hard army to run, lots of fragile units that if you make a mistake with them, losing big chunks of your army could happen very, very quickly. Still though, they've got lots of strong options to bring to bear. For this review of Eldar units, we are just going to be focusing on the core Craftworld ones. At least for this video, we're not going to be covering Harlequins or Inari. Hopefully I will aim to catch up with them on faction reviews when I get a chance. That still does leave us with a whole ton of stuff to cover though, so let's jump in, and we'll go through each part of the force organisation chart one unit at a time. So first up, we'll start with the troops, and these very pretty new redone Guardian Defenders, the Eldar's Martial Citizenry. They're 9 points per model, and you fill them in units of 10, they can take a Grav platform if you like. Your standard issue Eldar Warriors do have some fairly good close range anti-infantry fire with their shurikens, and they can at least chip some wounds off hard targets with their rend effect on wound rolls of 6. They are troops with Auspex as well, and are maybe just a tiny bit harder to kill than they used to be with their 4+ armor save, and they potentially can strike fairly heftily either out of the Webway or Wave Serpent, particularly if you give them a Farseer with Doom, or you run them in that Hail of Doom custom Craftworld for some superior shurikens. I don't think it's all good news for them though, they're just not super durable, which you'll see as a common weakness throughout just about half the codex, and that is kind of telling as these guys are tougher than the majority of units point for point. They are somewhat short ranged, not all that efficient against hard targets without support like Doom, and perhaps one of their biggest issues is that they're the most expensive troop slot. Far more people seem to run minimum sized ranger squads, which are often a better idea for camping out on far-flung objectives or dedicating minimum effort to home field ones. Overall I think they're usable enough, though usually a bit overshadowed. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10. Next up we've got the Rangers, who also received some very snazzy nice new models. 13 points per model, but you can take them in units of 5, so they can be a very cheap troop slot for just 65 points. Per model, with those camo cloaks, they are at least reasonably tough if they can get cover. The +1 to the saves does help quite a bit, and they've got some sniper fire that can chip some wounds off characters, and it can be quite a nice way to dial in a wound with Strands of Fate, which could give you an automatic mortal wound if you desperately need to finish something off. Their advanced positions can give them some forward deployment. If it's better that they lay down their lives just screening and sacrificing themselves to block an enemy, then all the better. Or you could have them camp out on far-flung objectives towards the edge of the board, maybe hiding out of line of sight so the opponent actually has to move up to them to take them out. You do also have the option of the wire weave net for some mortal wounds when they're charged, or a -1 to hit, though both of those are a fair bit pricier now at 10 points. As for downsides, they are fairly easy to kill in melee, not particularly excellent for a unit that's likely to be on the front lines. Their damage is a bit mediocre, even against characters, and while they do appear in just about every competitive list, I feel like they might be a bit of a top troops choice more by necessity rather than preference. You tend to just see them run in minimum size units to fill out the detachment slots, because they do provide some better utility than some of the rest for cheap. Still though, they have some very nice tricks. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10 overall, likely to see play in a lot of strong Eldar lists, even if troops maybe aren't the highlight of the codex. Next up we've got the Storm Guardians, 8 points per model, so a little bit cheaper than the Defenders, so 80 points for a unit to fill them in a squad of 10. On the plus side, they are cheaper than Defenders, so fill slots a little bit more efficiently than them, and again as far as Eldar go, toughness 3 infantry with a 4+ save for 8 points isn't dreadful, though it's hardly stand out durability wise compared with other factions. On the downsides though is that they just really don't do that much. Their melee damage only grants them 2 attacks at strength 3, AP -1. It's only going to be scary against the very lightest of infantry, and to my mind it just about always seems worth it to upgrade to Defenders for the extra point for some genuinely fairly scary shuriken fire. Again, if you're just looking at cheap squads to hold objectives, then Rangers will do that for 15 points less, and I think it really just does leave the Storm Guardians struggling for a place in the codex. I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10 overall. Not unusable though for Eldar chaff. The last troops choice are the Corsair Void Reavers, 10 points per model, and a kind of weird unit as they don't fill compulsory detachment slots and they don't get the Craftworld keyword. The Void Reavers can be taken in pretty small squads though, just 50 points per model, though that doesn't mean that you can fill detachments cheaper as they don't fill those mandatory slots for you. Damage wise, they've got OK shuriken fire that auto wounds on 6s, and you do have the option of trading out to the power swords, which can actually make them a moderately threatening melee troop slot, far more so than Storm Guardians. If you are feeling a bit more spendy, then you can deck them out with some special weapons and things, like a Wraith Cannon, though probably one of the things that draws you to the unit more than anything else is the fact that they're cheap infantry. Besides things like 2 Warlocks on their own, they're the cheapest infantry in the whole book, and that could be okay for doing actions or sitting around on objectives. Still though, for the actual threat of the models, I don't really think that they deal all that much damage, are all that tough for 10 points, plus not filling the troop slots means that they will often get overlooked I think. Unless you're going for some sort of weird themed thing, then I don't think it's really worth it to run Iriel just so they do. Overall, I'd rank them a 6 out of 10. Not unusable as a cheap throwaway unit, but they do have their limitations and no synergy with your given craft world. Elite's choices next, and first up we have the Wraith Guard. 40 or 45 points per model depending on whether you upgrade to D-Scythes, and on the plus side they are a fairly big and tough Eldar unit with -1 damage and a good target for spells like Fortune for the Feel No Pain. They're really quite a big blocky core unit, so they make good use of just about every other buff in the book, whether it's a 1 unit spell or a stratagem. Their close range shooting is pretty dangerous in both of its forms, and they do have the ability to shoot in combat provided they've got the Wraith Cannons, though weirdly I think that the core blast rules still stop them firing in melee if they've got the scythes. As for downsides, they only have a 5-inch movement and are relatively short at range, so it is often going to be possible just to completely outrange them if your opponent needs to. And I do feel that they're in pretty direct competition with the Wraith Blades, which are a bit tougher with access to 4+ invul save shields. Even with the shoots in melee rule, they still don't really want to be in combat, it's still going to mess with their target priorities and limit their options, and that's not so great on a unit moving up the board slowly. Overall not unusable, but not standout, I'd rank them a 6 out of 10. Moving on to their combat cousins in the Wraith Blades, again they're 40 or 45 points per model depending on whether you upgrade to Axe and Shield, which I think most cases I usually would. Similar to the Wraith Guards, but just actually good in combat, you've either got the choice of a flurry of damage 1 attacks from the blades, or damage 2 with higher strength from the axe, and I think that the axe is worth the upgrade as the 4+ invul save makes them genuinely tanky. They do still feel like a bit of a big investment unit though. I think I'd really want to have some sort of seer on standby to cast Fortune, as just by fielding them in the first place you're committing a lot of points to a unit for the privilege of good defense. They can advance for a bit of extra movement with no worry about guns, but still they are relatively slow as a melee unit. They're only going to reach what the opponent puts in range of them, and in combat their damage output, while respectable, isn't standout. They are more of a draw just for the sheer toughness I think. Still though, usable enough with the right investment, I'd score them a 7 out of 10 overall. Some Aspect Warriors next, and first up we have the Howling Banshees, a pretty common pick in the Elite's choice, 19 points per model, and can charge really quite far across the board and put out a high volume of low strength high AP attacks. Advance and charge is really great for them. You can potentially lock in a really long advance roll with a Strands of Fate dice, meaning that they'll have a guaranteed longer charge range, and then after that they've even got a lot of benefits when they charge into melee, making the enemy fight last, cancelling their overwatch, which is kind of key for fragile infantry, and having a -1 to hit at all times as well. A common pick is to take an Exarch with the Mirror Swords and damage 2, that's really quite scary just all by itself, and the whole squad gets a +1 to wound when they charge into, meaning that their high volume attacks should threaten just about everything in the game. Really the Banshees have just got a crazy amount of special rules going for them. On the downside though, they do remain very fragile, even with -1 to hit. Bolters, lasguns or light artillery fire can easily cripple the squad, and even with +1 to wound they will struggle against anything that's toughness 8 or 9 without external buffs. You might need Doom or Jinx to cut them down to size a little bit and ensure that they get more wounds through. Still though, a very solid unit to just delete enemy infantry. Overall I'd score them a 9 out of 10. Next up, and for more on-foot aspect assault, we've got the Striking Scorpions at 18 points per model. They can set up in the midfield with their advanced positions and potentially get somewhere threatening. They've got slightly better defense than the Banshees with a 3+ save, and when they make combat they spit out a whole flurry of strength 5 melee attacks with exploding 6s and mortal wounds on a wound roll of a 6. The most common Exarch take for these guys is the Biting Blade and Crushing Blow combo. It allows the Exarch to deal out a rather huge amount of AP2 damage to attacks and then auto wound with all of them. Again, with the common downside for Aspect Warriors, despite their power armor, they're still fragile for the cost. and though the Crushing Blow Exarch can certainly help, they might still struggle with vehicles and monsters as their Manda Blasters don't work against them. Still though, a solid competitive unit, they can certainly deal out a whole load of hurt and set up somewhere in hiding in the midfield, so they're more likely to be able to reach the enemy to do so. I've ranked them an 8 out of 10 overall. Next up we've got the Fire Dragons, 24 points per model, and the anti-tank elite of the Eldar. With their stat line they basically get souped up melter guns, 12-inch range, but they always activate the melter special rule, always getting d6 plus 2 damage. The short range is a bit of an issue, as it means that they need some sort of delivery system. Often jumping out of a falcon seems pretty reasonable, or you could pay CP to put them in the webway. Toughness 4 and a 3+ save helps their defense a little, but with that massively high points cost at 24 points, it's still a long way from being good durability for the cost. In general, for their role, I think that they do fine, particularly in any of the Craftworlds that give you a single hit or wound reroll. That'll go a long way on such powerful weapons, but you are kind of forced to invest even more points in them, such as the Falcon or the Webway, and you might not get all that much value in return if you're either screened from your ideal targets, or there's just no good hard targets around for them to get their melter into. Overall, I'd score them a 7 out of 10, good for their given role, but still not quite enough to have them make their way into top Eldar armies that often. Moving on, we've got the Eldar Boys in Blue. At 13 points each, we have the Dire Avengers. They're perhaps some of the scariest shurikens in the Codex, with AP -2, and it's near mandatory to include a second one of them on the Exarch as well, for even more bladed fire. Again, they're a unit that can really take some external buffs very well. They work great with Guide, Doom, and that Hail of Doom custom trait as well. Certainly with the Doom power or the Hail of Doom trait, a unit of 10 of these is almost guaranteed to shave off rather a lot of wounds against whatever they're targeting, never mind the havoc that they cause to standard infantry. Again, being a little bit on the short range side, they can be another choice for the Webway or Wave Serpents, and for the Exarch they've got a few interesting options that they can take, being able to shoot an action with the Exarch upgrade, maybe getting objectives secured via an Exarch trait as well, or you could potentially have both of those on the same unit if you do have a Seer around to cast Will of Azayan on them. Again, as with most Eldar, they're generally a bit fragile for the cost on the counter-attack. They will lose chunks of the squad to light infantry fire, and they're perhaps a little bit less standout than most now the points cost increased a little bit. Still though, at just 13 points per model, they are one of the cheaper aspects, and perhaps a little bit more expendable than most. Overall, I think they're still a very, very solid unit for the Eldar, and I'd rank them a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got some Seers with the Warlocks and the Warlock Skyrunners. Two slightly weird Elite's Choice units where you can either get a character for 40 points or 60 points, or if you have more models in the unit, they don't count as a character unit, so can be directly shot, but the cost goes down, so it's 20 points per model on foot, or 35 points per model on bike. I think it's quite a rare competitive Eldar list that won't use some Warlocks. They do have some pretty awesome psychic powers, Protect and Jinx for messing with saves, and Quicken and Restrain for boosting your units around the board or slowing down the enemies. They can also smite if needed, and I think they're pretty awesome value for how many points they cost, either just 40 points for the foot one, and just 60 or 70 points for the one with the crazy jet mic mobility, zooming around the board and maybe even spitting out a little bit of firepower as well. They're easy to include in army lists as they're slotless with a Farseer, which again almost all lists will take, and they potentially can be another cheap choice for using things like psychic secondaries, or just reaching primary objectives later in the game with a Skyrunner dashing around. On the downside, their defensive profile is pretty dreadful if they ever get exposed. They lose the character protection if they're in multi-model units if they do want more wounds as well, and they're not exactly frontline damage dealers, don't expect them to do too much in combat. Still though, none of those are the biggest deal if you can keep them hidden or protected. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10 overall, very good value. Next up we've got the Wraith Lord. You can build them for 100 points base, though generally people will want to upgrade with different weapons. The Ghostglaive can give you some pretty powerful and threatening damage D3+3 melee, plus you can take things like Bright Lances or Shuriken Cannons. The toughness again is okay for Eldar. Toughness 8 with 9 wounds and -1 damage is at least fairly sturdy for stomping its way towards objectives. It is a big and stompy core unit as well, and that can be handy for some synergies. Overall, I'd perhaps say that Wraith Lords are units that are perfectly usable but maybe not standout. Their movement is kind of okay at 8 inches, and it means that the opponent might be able to back off for a turn or two before dealing with them. Lack of an invul save means that it can die pretty fast to high AP and the crazy high damage weapons that are around in 9th edition. And in an Eldar list there might not be all that much other vehicle targets exposed, so it might attract the brunt of enemy firepower. Some of the bigger psychic buffs and things are probably still better placed on other core units, Maybe things like Dire Avengers or big blocks of Wraithblade or Wraithguard. Though it's maybe not the worst choice in the world to do a little bit of castling up with, you could have a few of them with rerolls around a Spirit Seer if you wanted. Overall, I'd rank them a 7 out of 10. Solidly usable, but maybe not one of the best units in the book. Finally, for Elites units, we have the Corsair Void Guard, 12 points per model, and kind of a similar sort of unit to the Void Reavers in the troop slot, getting the auto wounds on 6s, but these guys get an extra attack and access to some specialists. For the most part, I don't think that they're enormously efficient compared with some of the Eldar units, but the bit that I do like about them is the option to take a hidden psyker within the unit for 25 points, meaning that you could potentially have something like a backfield objective squad sitting around and farming CP all game, while the rest of your psykers that are screened can go around casting their more important powers and buffing your frontline units. In general though, for their raw damage and defense, I don't think that they quite hold up to the other Eldar elites like say Banshees or Scorpions. I think they'd usually do you better, and while their special weapons are quite fun, I still don't think that they're particularly stand out either. I'd rank them 7 out of 10, broadly just for the hidden psyker, though probably a bit lower, maybe a 6 if they were being used as a frontline unit. Fast attack next, and first up we have the Arrowswift Shining Spears, super elite Eldar jet bikers that cost 35 points per model, and are very fast with a 16-inch movement, and really quite threatening indeed, as they can deal decent damage both at shooting and in charging. They're a surprisingly effective ranged unit with 4 shuriken shots plus a laser lance hit, and then double down on that with a flurry of AP-4, strength 6 and damage 2 melee hits, which are pretty much perfect for chewing through 2 wound Space Marines. The 16-inch move should usually get them where they need to go, but they do particularly love Seinhan as well for an advance and charge stratagem. That makes their threat range from great to ludicrous, as it means they can easily jump from one deployment zone to another and charge something key. On top of that, they've got some pretty awesome Exarch upgrades as well. The Paragon Saber plus Heart Strike can allow you to deal really quite a lot of mortal wounds, always a good thing when trying to dominate melee. Kane's Lance can allow you an extra D3 mortal wounds and fights last on the roll of a 4+, and Expert Lancers can give you a +1 to hit for the whole unit on the charge. All solid options if you just want a little bit more damage for the unit. As for downsides, as ever with Eldar, they're easy to kill in return despite the -1 to hit that they have. They really do need to make the most of their first strike unless they can keep very safe afterwards, and if the enemy has decent invul saves or -1 damage, it can certainly blunt their damage output of their spears. Overall though, a strong unit. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. Next up we've got the Wind Riders, 20 points base, and another nice fast moving unit of cheap Eldar jet bikes, all about the range with their shuriken catapults, though they can upgrade to shuriken cannons for 10 points if you want. I think that they're far better than the scatter lasers these days. As with other shuriken weapons, they make good use of Doom and Jinx if it's on offer, plus Hail of Doom if you're using that Craftworld, and can be quite good in Ulthway as well for the +1 to hit stratagem that they get with Guardian units. Being fairly longer range jet bikes, they can make some good use of battle focus as well, just nose into the edge of terrain, shooting, and then just going slightly round the corner. Might allow some shenanigans for shooting but not being shot if the enemy can't move fast enough. If you do take the shorter range shurikens though, then they do actually have some pretty decent defense for Eldar purposes too. Toughness 4, 2 wounds and a 3+ save isn't bad for 20 points, particularly on a unit that moves quite so quickly. These were one of the units that perhaps suffered a fair bit from the nerf to Hail of Doom. You can no longer take that custom Craftworld attribute with another one, it has to be your entire thing now, and that does seem to have led to a fair few less people playing these. The Eldar fast attack is very congested as well, with other great units around, and it seems that for chaff cheap jet bike units, people often seem to be going for individual Vipers now, as they're even cheaper and more expendable, and do much the same thing. Moving on, we come to the Warp Spiders, slightly pricey aspect warriors at 22 points per model. They teleport in, either starting on the board or in deep strike, and spam out a bunch of strength 6 AP-2 shots with their death spinners. They're pretty close range, but they do have some fairly decent damage output, around 14 hits for a 5-man squad, provided you take the second death spinner on the Exarch. Then they've got a fair few different special rules that allow them to do some good escape. They can move 2d6 from battle focus, which would allow them to jump behind terrain, though with only 12-inch range it does mean that they might not still get all that far away. Flicker Jump can allow them to back off when they're charged, and he can take the Web of Deceit upgrade, which allows them to jump somewhere else on the board entirely and stay very safe for that turn at least. Otherwise, I think that quite a lot of the other upgrade support options for the Warp Spiders are pretty interesting. The Spider's Bite can actually give them a little bit of genuine melee threat with damage too, and Surprise Assault can make a squad a bit better on the Alpha Strike, getting them an extra shot with their Death Spinners once they come out of the webway. Overall, I would say that Warp Spiders are alright. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10 in total. I think perhaps one of their main issues is that again they face some very tough competition from the other fast attack choices. I think in general people are usually going to run Swooping Hawks still, just for the sheer mobility that they have, and their short range on the Death Spinners is still quite a big limitation, even with their ways of getting away. I've given them a 7 out of 10 for now. I might well have been tempted to put them up to an 8 though. Speaking of Swooping Hawks, they're aspect warriors that cost 20 points per model. They spam out a whole ton of anti-infantry shooting at 24 inches, and they do have a pretty crazy datasheet ability to allow them to jump away. Each Hawk gets 4 shots at 24 inches with strength 4 AP nothing, but they will get a slightly inordinate amount of wounds on the targets due to hit rolls of a 6 auto wounding. They've got good movement to get line of sight on what they need to, and then whenever they've shot they can basically redeploy instead of using battle focus and set themselves up again somewhere safe behind terrain, all ready to jump out again with their good movement and hit something else with a bunch of shots. Against a lot of armies that don't have fast movers or long range artillery, then they're basically going to be able to strike with impunity against the enemy for several turns, hopefully racking up enough damage along the way to justify their existence, and then in later turns they can maybe be a bit more bold or sacrifice themselves, throwing themselves onto objectives or making bolder plays. Their unit upgrades seem usable as well. Las Blasters are commonly taken on the Exarchs for a little bit of extra strength and AP. The Phoenix Plume is fairly justifiable in big squads, giving you a feel no pain type save. That will make the unit just a little bit tougher to remove if and when they get exposed. Baharoth, who's also very good, can give them objectives secured if he's nearby. And they've got a nice grenade pack stratagem that if the enemy moves too close to them, they can potentially choose to zip across them and deal out a whole bunch of mortal wounds. As for weaknesses, without the Phoenix Plume, they're spectacularly fragile even by Eldar standards. Light artillery or fast moving units could punish them hard if they can get a line of sight, and their damage output isn't super strong given how fast and flexible it is. To be fair, that's probably a good thing though, as being able to strike with good damage outputs without being able to get hit back would be kind of silly. If they are playing cagey and remaining safe as well, they won't necessarily help with objectives very much, as they won't want to expose themselves and get the risk of being shot. It might depend a bit on just how good enemy movement is and whether it's safe to set them up, and how bold they're feeling later in the last few turns. Overall though, a really strong unit. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10, should certainly help Eldar lists hoover up light infantry, while being spectacularly annoying to deal with. Next up we've got Vipers, 40 points for a very cheap hefty jet bike. Within the Eldar Codex, cheap units really are a great thing to have around, as there's very little in the book that's all that expendable, and you can afford to just throw away on suicide missions on objectives. It's very fast, and it's relatively tough for the cost for Eldar as well. 6 wounds at toughness 5 and a 3+ save really isn't bad for 40 points, and if you are pointing it at light infantry, its damage output isn't even bad either, with a bunch of shuriken catapult and scatter laser shots. With a cheap cost and being at least a little bit tough and annoying to remove, it's a really good candidate just for zipping around the board, putting tough, annoying and expendable things on objectives, dealing a little bit of anti-infantry damage, and maybe going for other secondary objectives and things like helping out on engage on all fronts. If you want a bit of extra damage output, you could think about shuriken cannons or bright lances as well, though I think that the cheap and cheerful one works just fine. Again, for these advantages, its damage output isn't super high, only really that great against light infantry unless upgraded. And again, I think you'd ideally want to run them in ones, which means that it could be competing with things like Swooping Hawks for the fast attack slots. Overall though, I think it's a really nice unit for what it does, and I'd rank it an 8 out of 10. Lastly, for the fast attack, we have the Ranger jet bikes in the Shroud Runners, 35 points per model and minimum squad size of 3. These things are very fast with a pre-game movement, so could be in the opponent's deployment zone turn 1 if they wanted to be. Pack a scatter laser for a bunch of anti-infantry, and a Ranger long rifle for a little bit of sniping. Like the jet bikes with their long range, they can potentially be an interesting choice for using battle focus, potentially just nosing around the edge of obscuring terrain and then using battle focus to back off to safety. 36 inches does mean that they should be able to draw a bead on quite a bit of stuff, but even if it does make more sense to go into cover or something, they get at least some fairly decent defense with those camo cloaks, potentially having a 2+ save at range, which again is pretty nice for Eldar. They've also got an opportunistic wire weave grenade thing, and they can mark targets for other rangers if it makes sense to. Overall, they feel like a bit of a premium utility unit, cost a fair bit to put on the table, but could be very annoying and get exactly where you want to. It is kind of counterbalanced by their damage output just not being all that great though. Again, maybe like the Swooping Hawks, hopefully they could have a few turns of staying safe and zipping around the board with great movement, but if the enemy does manage to reach them or catch them out of cover, they're going to go down very fast indeed. Overall, I think they're usable enough. I certainly wouldn't spam them in a list, but I'd rank them somewhere around the 7 or 8 level myself. Let's bring the guns of Vol with the heavy support now, and first up we have the Dark Reapers. The Aspect Warrior squad that got a recent resculpt, but also in their process got their squad size locked to 5, so besides Exarch upgrades, the 5 of them come for 150 points now. They are interesting, as they're pretty much the most long-range core infantry, and they are okay for buffs like Farseer things, and their damage output, while not being spectacular, is fairly general purpose at least. They should at least do some reasonably decent damage against most things that they target. They ignore dense cover, and the Exarch can take certain upgrades like a Tempest launcher to allow a little barrage fire, but I think that the squad does come with some pretty serious drawbacks. First up, they've got no battle focus, which will be super annoying to play against if they had it, but at the same time, as 1 wound Aspect Warrior infantry that cost 30 odd points, it means that they're ridiculously fragile and need to sit out in the open. They do have the option to fire and fade once per game, but that still costs 2 CP. Their damage output just isn't really super strong enough to compete with the other various guns available to the Eldar, and their small unit size means that they're not able to make particularly decent use of things like Farseer buffs and 1 unit spells or stratagems. They were particularly disappointed that their heavy weapons now suffer the penalty to move unless they get upgraded with an Exarch upgrade too, as in general they're usually going to be a unit that wants to pop out of terrain and then fire off some shots. Overall, I think that these guys went from being one of the strongest units in the Codex to one of the weakest. I'd score them a 5 out of 10 overall, not completely unusable, but certainly far from standout amongst their peers. For perhaps some slightly scarier guns, we have the support weapons. 45 points with Shadow Weavers, or 65 points with the D-cannons. I'm not really convinced on the Vibro cannons being strong enough to include. Out of the 2 barrage options though, I believe that the D-cannon really is the standout one. A short range at 24 inches, but D3 shots at strength 12, AP 4 and damage D6 plus 2, plus the chance for mortals, and able to target enemies out of line of sight, albeit being forced to take a to-hit penalty and a penalty to AP. Despite that though, with quite so many shots hitting at quite such a threatening profile, I think they're still well worth it. Perhaps a bit more of an area denial type units should try and deploy somewhere in range of the midfield objectives, as opposed to something to reach out and strike your opponent's deployment zone though. I think they're perhaps particularly relevant in Ulthwé once more. They can make them +1 to hit with their stratagem, and they quite like the single reroll as well. Otherwise the Shadow Weaver is okay. Fairly cheap at just 45 points, you could leave it sat on a home field objective if you wanted to. D6 shots at strength 6, AP -2 isn't terrible. It would cause some pain to infantry units over the course of a few turns, and it is quite long ranged. As for downsides, I feel like they're a unit that do have a fair bit of counterplay. They really don't want to be caught in melee. The D-cannons have pretty short range, so even with their movement the enemy could just measure 30 inches away from them and know that they're safe, though that is still a fair bit of area denial. Still though, a solid usable unit overall. I'd rank them an 8 out of 10. It is fairly terrifying knowing that sort of firepower can hit the unit of the enemy's choice, even if you're hiding behind a wall. Next up we've got the War Walkers, a heavy support choice for 55 points base, and pack 2 of your favourite Eldar heavy weapons of your choice, perhaps Shuriken cannons and Bright Lances seeming the most interesting choices to me. They aren't dreadful for durability, with a 5+ invul and 6 wounds. They could be okay again for just jumping onto objectives and giving the enemy a moderately durable threat to take down, while getting a bit more damage than things like Vipers would do for the same role. Perhaps one of their biggest draws as well is that they can be there right from the turn 1, as they get advanced positions to set up in the midfield, potentially allowing them to get hidden early or allowing them some decent lines of sight. When the Codex dropped, I did wonder whether they would be core or not, but it seems that Games Workshop have held off on that, not wanting to allow people to buff them too crazily. I would say personally that I probably prefer Vipers for the same role, to be honest. They're a lot faster and have fly, and the underslung Shuriken catapults are still pretty solid. Overall though, I'd rank War Walkers a 7 out of 10, still very usable, and they are in a far less congested slot. Next up we've got the all-rounder grav tank in the Falcon. 145 points at base. It comes packing a pulse laser with strength 9 and damage D3 plus 3, plus a bunch of shuriken or scatter laser weapons that might be upgraded. It's kind of interesting that it's halfway between a mainline battle tank and a drop pod. The Cloud Strike ability basically allows you to jump in turn 1 and deliver an Aspect Warrior squad into the midst of the fray. Potentially a good choice for something like Dire Avengers or Fire Dragons, who want to get the Alpha Strike on the enemy and not the other way around. On the downsides, I feel like it's maybe not all that massively efficient just as a tank on its own. You'd probably need to get decent mileage both out of its firepower and out of the troop delivery to really make it that worth it, and it's not really all that tough for the cost for a unit that you might well be throwing down somewhere close to the front lines. Still though, solidly threatening, packs some decent firepower and some really fun utility. I'd rank it an 8 out of 10 overall. Moving on, we have the Scary Fire Prism, 165 points for a tank with a massive crystal gun. A scary profile with 2 shots at strength 14, AP 5 and damage 3d3, and the scary ability to take 2 of them, combine fire for 2 CP, and then channel all those shots through 1 fire prism and have it ignore invuls as well. If your opponent's got really big scary things on the other side of the board like knights, they're not going to thank you for that. On top of that, if you've got vectored engines as well, you might well be able to pull off that combo and then battle focus your way back to safety. Perhaps a bit more viable on these tanks than just about anywhere else, because with that stratagem you only need to expose 1 of them per turn, so the vectored engines kind of go further to protect both tanks. It does have pretty great movement as well, so it's likely to be able to get decent lines of sight. Overall, they're definitely a very scary threat, though I would say that they do cost a pretty big premium to put this kind of thing on the board. A couple of the tanks, plus the vectored engines, are going to be running you at something like 350 or 370 points, plus whenever you want to link fire to actually ignore the invuls, that's going to be another big 2 CP, quite a hefty price tag in Nephilim. Depending on the terrain as well, they might also not be the easiest tank to hide, with really quite a big profile and a massive long gun. If they're able to be exposed, again they die fairly easily to return fire for the cost. Overall, I'd rank them a 7 out of 10. Might have been persuaded to put them up to an 8. Certainly a pretty terrifying unit to have on the other side of the board, but I guess you are trading out quite a lot of stuff to bring them along. Lastly, for the heavy support grav tanks, we have the Artillery Night Spinner, 140 points base and fairly general purpose artillery with strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2. It particularly gets on well with custom Craftworlds that ignore cover and the single reroll Craftworlds like Bealtan and Ulthway. It moves fast, it's got good range, it should be able to stay safe, and it should be able to stay safe while dealing out its damage at long range. The main downside is that its damage just isn't all that spectacular anymore. It was quite a common choice before barrage weapons got nerfed across the game. Now if it ignores line of sight, it'll normally be hitting at AP -1 and also -1 to hit. And for a lot of people that just doesn't seem to be worth the cost with the close range and more threatening D cannons. I guess at least they already have mad AP to begin with, so it doesn't matter as much if they lose a little bit. Still though, this should be reliably able to deal damage exactly where you need it for a fair few turns. It can sometimes be worth paying the premium for some artillery fire just where you want it, and I'd rank the Night Spinner a 7 out of 10 overall. Moving on to the main Lord of War for the Codex, and we have the Wraith Knight, a big 400 point tanky Wraith construct. It comes base with the big Ghost Glaive and the shield for a 4+ invul, and at that kind of profile it is very solid to remove from the board. It has been helped out at least in recent times by super heavy auxiliary detachments now not costing anything in Nephilim, so at least you're just paying for the points cost and not the CP. And I will admit that its weapon damage is at least fairly impressive. The Wraith Cannon can deal some easy mortals with Strands of Fate, plus both the glaive and the guns have decent weapon profiles anyway. I think perhaps the hardest choices for the Wraith Knight is that you can't really build one as an all-rounder. You can have the good melee with the sword, the good defense with the 4+ invul shield, or good firepower with 1 or more guns, but you can't have all of them. If you take the sword and shield, then it's very tough, but locks to dealing only any meaningful damage in melee. And if you trade out for the guns, you're either giving up good combat, good saves, and you're also going to be paying a fair amount of points for the privilege to do so as well. As a Titanic unit, it also is locked out of certain synergies within the Codex, likely won't be getting a Craftworld attribute in the auxiliary detachments, and super heavies do have issues with terrain as well. It can't hide behind obscuring cover. Overall, it just all adds up to it not being taken very regularly at all. Overall, I'd rank the Wraith Knight a 5 out of 10. Still not completely worthless in slightly less optimised games, but it's a rare sight in any sort of competitive list. Next up, we've got the Webway Gate at 80 points for the Eldar Fortification. The point of this thing is to deliver Eldar from a strategic reserve straight into the centre of the battlefield and potentially very close to the enemy for some easy charges if they get too close. It's terrain that can't be destroyed, so you can't really do much about it once it's down. You just need to work around it, and you do need to put units into strategic reserve for it, but it does at least make them cheaper by halving the cost. Ideally, I think you'd want to deploy this slightly further up the board, maybe very close to a vital midfield objective if you can, and then be able to have your Eldar troops emerge straight onto it and potentially kill any enemies that they find there. Really quite an interesting utility piece, I think, though it does have a fair few drawbacks. It doesn't do anything for damage or defense besides helping you get the Alpha Strike, which admittedly is useful. You do still need to invest CP in strategic reserves to use it, which isn't awesome in Nephilim, and perhaps it's just a little bit predictable with where units are going to come onto the board, so if the opponent puts units on the objective, they do basically know that they're going to get attacked. Perhaps the most annoying thing about it though is the Fortification deployment rules, which still have the core rule stipulation that they need to be greater than 3 inches away from any other terrain piece, and it might really limit where this thing sets up. Still though, I think it's usable enough, provided that you can guarantee that you're actually going to be able to put it down somewhere meaningful. They do occasionally get used in top lists. I'd rank it a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Eldar Flyers. First up, the Crimson Hunter for 175 points base, though you can spend a fair bit more on upgrades. This guy's a fast mobile anti-tank unit that's particularly nice against anything with fly, getting +1 to hit against those targets and also re-rolling wound rolls. It strikes with a fair amount of D3+3 damage or potentially star cannons and has great mobility zooming around the board. It should be able to get line of sight on what it wants to. A few of the Exarch upgrades are pretty interesting as well. +1 to hit and +1 wound if you take any of them, and then you get your choice of either ignores cover, a 5+ invul, or auto hitting against fly targets, all of which I think are tempting enough. As with most flyers in the game though, it really does pay a premium for the cost of its speed and being able to almost guarantee you get the firepower where it needs to be. If the enemy's got long range anti-tank, it's not going to be too hard to bring this thing down, and it was a bit sad that they lost the double pivot rule to give them the extra mobility. Overall, I'd say it's again one of the units that's usable but not standout. I'd rank it a 7 out of 10 overall. The other Eldar flyer choice is the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. A bit more pricey at base, this one at 215 points, but it does have a fair few fun things going for it. Again, it moves fast, packs some fairly chunky firepower with the heavy D size for damage 2, has a Mind Shock pod for -2 leadership to nearby infantry, and cast the debuff part of a Warlock power or Smite if it just makes more sense to deal more damage. Being able to zoom up and cast Jinx on what you need to I think is quite cool. It's also a little bit sturdier than the Crimson Hunter per the point as well. It gets -1 damage from Wraithbone form, which will be quite handy against anything with mid-strength damage 2 weapons trying to take it out. Again though, it does have really quite a high cost at 215 points. In general, you're going to need to hope that you get multiple turns of use out of it to really justify itself. And again, its defense isn't super amazing for the cost and needs to get fairly close to the enemy for the powers, the leadership and the D-Scythes. Again, brings some interesting stuff to the table. I'd rank it a 7 out of 10 overall. Quite a fun model to use, but maybe not super duper optimal. Next up, we've got the Wave Serpent, the fairly luxury Craftworld transport choice that really does quite a lot of things right. It does cost 145 points, so it is at least fairly pricey, but the Eldar definitely have good roles for transport in the army, just having quite so much fragile but dangerous infantry that they want to transport, anything from Howling Banshees to Dire Avengers or Fire Dragons. As a transport, it can genuinely add to their movement. With a big 16-inch move, it will get things where they need to go. While it moves across, it can deal out some firepower, maybe either some shuriken cannon shots or perhaps upgrading to Bright Lancers. And as Eldar armor goes, it is rather tough. It gets a transhuman physiology roll, a big 13 wounds and a 5+ invul from its Serpent Shield. Overall, I think it is pretty usable to deliver things like Banshees or Dire Avengers. It does pay a bit of a hefty price, but even after once it's done its transport job, it's still a fairly dangerous gun turret, plus it's something that can go onto objectives and not be all that easy to kill. I'd rank it an 8 out of 10 overall, a pretty solid transport unit. Moving on, we get to the HQ section. I thought we'd start with the Farseers, pretty much being one of the most standout units for the Eldar in the whole book. The 3 main flavours of them that you can take are the standard one on foot for 95 points, the Skyrunner on the jet bike for 125, or Eldrad Ulthuan, the Ulthway special character, for 145. The Farseers are pretty much the core linchpin unit of the whole codex, often fielded in multiples, and they've got enough psychic powers that they've got loads of good ones that they might want to field, to the extent where they're kind of spoilt for choice. Guide and Doom are pretty amazing for any damage dealer units. Things like Banshees, Dire Avengers, Scorpions or Jet Bikes will all love those. Doom gets on particularly well with anything Shuriken, as it gives you more chance of getting more wounds with the low strength weapons, and plus getting extra 6s for the bonus AP. Fortune can be quite a nice choice for Wraith units, making them into a genuinely annoying unit to remove with a 5+ feel no pain. If you can spare one cast somewhere, then they can farm out command points. Potentially an extra 5 CP over the course of the game is pretty nice. You can build them for damage as well, maybe combining Smite and Executioner. If you can target an enemy infantry unit with that, it's pretty likely to be able to cause 3d3 mortal wounds, which is pretty solid, and can make them a fast moving threatening unit that can zip around quite good and clear out enemy units that are isolated. Then you can also help out units on objectives with the Will of Azayan. That one allows you to shoot while doing an action, which could be quite nice for dire Avengers, and also gives you objective secured, which could allow you to snatch an objective from under the opponent's nose. Loads of good choices and plenty of setups that you could potentially run. On top of that, they can manipulate Strands of Fate rolls better. You get to re-roll a dice per each of them on the board, potentially fishing for some better results, and they do allow you access to a few different stratagems, forewarned for some Eldar intercepting, an extra cast if they need to smite as well, and potentially a big and scary Eldritch Storm if the enemy is very bunched up, though Games Workshop did tone that down significantly, so your opponent needs to have absolutely loads of units stacked on top of each other for it to be all that worth it. For the 3 models, the basic one is just cheap and efficient psychic powers. 95 points for 2 casters, great. The Skyrunner pays an extra 30 points for some great mobility, zooming around the board plus a bit of shooting. You could maybe take the objective secured relic bike for them, or maybe if you're running that Hail of Doom Craftworld, you could think about Kurnos' bow. That's the relic shuriken pistol with a chance for some mortal wounds. Then if you're playing Ulthwé, you could take Eldrad as well. He casts 3 powers and casts them all really reliably between the Ulthwé bonus and his own rerolls. A very tempting pick if you are running an Ulthwé list. Overall, Farseers are absolutely standout. They don't really have that much melee or defense, but it's not exactly their main purpose, and being a bit reliant on Psychic does mean that just Eldar in general don't like fighting against lists that have lots of Psychic denial or protection. Despite that though, they are an absolutely essential unit in the Eldar army. I'd happily give them the full 10 out of 10, a really efficient support character that a lot of armies would very much envy. Perhaps one of the downsides of Farseers being so good is that Autarchs I think are just a touch outclassed. They're more the equivalent of an Eldar captain with a reroll 1s to hit aura. The standard one on foot costs 85 points, the Skyrunner 105, and Iriel, the Autarch of Iandin, costs 95. It's not like they don't bring a fair few interesting things to the table. They do have some okay melee with a Starglaive for damage 2 and strength 5. They will buff nearby troops with rerolls, maybe kind of handy for things like blocks of wraiths. I do feel though that with aspect warriors and things, they're often wanting to zoom up the board pretty quickly, and it's just not all that much good return on investment to coordinate the reroll aura as they hit combat. Otherwise, they potentially allow you to use the command point reroll stratagem twice in a phase, which is kind of interesting, but often it just doesn't tend to be the single best return on CP that you can get, and it might just be a way to get rid of all of your command points early in the game faster than you might want, and not have enough for powerful stratagems later on. As for the variants, the basic model gets some very flexible gear, can be really fast with the warp jump generator or swooping hawk wings, the fusion gun can give him some punchy anti-tank shot at range, and the Banshee mask is quite an interesting choice for making enemies fight last and cancelling Overwatch. I think in general though, I probably would rate the Skyrunner slightly higher. Great movement with the jet bike, an inbuilt decent power weapon with the laser lance, okay shooting right off the bat, and he'll probably cost the same amount of points as well by the time you've added gear to the one on foot. He does have the option for that OBSEC relic bike as well, which is pretty interesting. Finally, I think Iriel is interesting enough as an on-foot option. His main advantage is getting a damage 3 Starglaive, not bad just for 10 points over the standard model, and potentially if you wanted to make a Corsair detachment happen, he could be an HQ for them if you wanted. As I mentioned, I think that the Farseers just add so much more utility for the buffs though, and I think they would like to be a choice that you could actually make into a decent combat character, but compared with other armies they just don't really have all that many fighty warlord traits or relics that make them truly shine in the morale phase in the same way as things like Drukhari Archons. Basically, Farseers do better for buffs, Phoenix Lords will generally do better and be tougher in combat, not leaving the Autarchs with a whole load of room. I'd rank them somewhere around the 6 to 7 mark overall, maybe a 7 for the jet bike one. Speaking of the Phoenix Lords, these are some of the great heroes of the Eldar. There's 6 in the Codex and 1 in the Forge World Compendium, and generally speaking they're fighty characters with the favourite of Kame rule that stops them taking more than 3 wounds in a single phase, so at least it means that you can never one-shot them. As well as their own unit abilities, they also make their nearby aspect braver. They have OBSEC themselves, and also grant it to their nearby aspect warriors too, which means that they can be quite a powerful force to have on objectives. For general downsides, they don't have any warlord traits, and they are a bit pricey for their defensive profile still. The takes no more than 3 wounds thing is pretty annoying to make them to deal with, but if the opponent can deal multi-phase damage to them, it can easily go down in a turn regardless. Out of the list, I certainly feel that some are stronger than others. I'd say that Bararoth still remains probably the standout choice at the moment. 160 points for a general purpose annoying threat, damage 2 shooting with OK AP, damage 2 melee with a power sword, a great movement, and the crazy swooping hawk ability to allow him to jump straight off the board after striking, potentially again allowing him to get multiple phases of damage in without ever getting hit back. Again can be really helpful late game as well, when he can bring that Auspex to bear and steal some objectives. Definitely a common pick in plenty of competitive Craftworld lists. Otherwise, Karandras, I'd rate an 8 out of 10. Quite a mighty all-round damage dealer Phoenix Lord. He gets to set up the board with his striking scorpions. He has rather solid melee with a damage 2 claw at good strength, and a fair amount of mortal wounds to chase it down with the Manda Blasters. Azaman, the Dire Avenger one, is okay. He has a 3+ invul, some good shooting at AP 2 and damage 2, and okay combat with strength 6 and damage 3 melee. A solid all-rounder as a frontline character. He could also make the Dire Avengers objectives secured as well. Fugan I think is getting a bit on the pricey side for a character. He's 170 points and does have some fun advantages such as being toughness 5, having a big strength 10, damage d6 plus 4 anti-tank shot, and OK melee. The anti-tank shot is a bit dependent on the enemy not having good invul saves though, and while his combat is pretty solid, it's just not really stand out for an 170 point model. Jane Czar's 150 points, moves very fast and has advance and charge, has all the Banshee Mask benefits of making enemies fight last, ignore Overwatch, and her one also does a -1 attacks debuff as well, plus actually has some fairly surprisingly solid shooting out of that Triskel. Pretty comparable damage to a lot of the others, plus massively fast while doing so, I think does make her one of the better choices. Morgan Ra's 160 points and spits out some strength 7 damage 2 shooting that causes worse enemy morale. It's quite nice that he's got some long range damage outputs, but his melee is a bit lackluster compared with most of them, and I think he's just going to struggle to deal enough damage to really justify his points cost all the way up at 160. Finally we've got Irilith of the Shadow Spectres in Forge World, 140 points, and actually has some fairly solid shooting at 24 inches, 3 shots at strength 8, AP 3, damage 3, has an inbuilt -1 to hit, and still fights with a damage 2 combat attack as well. Pretty fast moving and okay damage at range and melee I think are generally pretty good, plus he did get errated to have the same favourite of Kane rule as the rest of them do, so I think he's an okay choice. Overall, out of them I'd still say that Bararoth was the best though, and then other standout ones seem to me to be Karandras and Jane Czar, and then perhaps Irilith and Azaman not too far behind them. Moving on, we come to the mighty avatar of Kane itself, 280 points once awakened, and an absolutely brutal and mighty murder machine, really tough to take out at toughness 8, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, halving the damage that comes into it, and hitting very hard in melee with 7 attacks at strength 14, AP 5 and damage d6 plus 2. It's also got a sweep mode for dealing with hordes, and the Wailing Doom can do a beam shooting attack for a bit of melter damage. He does also buff nearby Eldar for reroll charges and better morale as well, which might come up from time to time. Overall I'd say that the avatar is usable enough. His raw damage and defense are both very threatening, and at least with a 10-inch movement he's got a reasonable chance of making it to combat by turn 2 if the opponent hasn't massively pulled back from him. If they do manage to screen him or ignore him for a turn though, then that can be a bit of an issue for ground-bound melee monsters. The buffs that he gives are a bit situational and not super awesome for nearby Craftworld troops, and if he isn't getting in combat with something meaningful, then he's rarely going to justify that 280 points. Even if he does make it into something good though, then things like transhuman physiology or good invuls can really take the bite out of that Wailing Doom, though against things like characters and vehicles, even a single failed save can be pretty punchy. Overall, I'd rate it a 7 out of 10. A solid and scary unit to put pressure on the enemy, though it does come with some pretty big drawbacks. Next up, we've got Illic Nightspear, the Ranger Commander of Alatok. Illic's a 90-point HQ that's armed with a Strength 6, AP 3, Damage 3 sniper rifle that deals a few extra mortal wounds if you roll a 4+ to wounds. It's perhaps a fairly interesting choice to use a Strands of Fate wound roll with, as that means that you've got a good chance at 3 damage plus d3 mortal wounds, and that could be a pretty credible threat at killing one support character dead in a single shot. Otherwise, besides that, he can't be shot outside of 12 inches, which means that he could be able to camp distant objectives provided the opponent couldn't reach them. He's got a little bit of melee when threatened with a power sword and 4 attacks, and he can forward deploy if it makes sense to, maybe again camping out on a far-flung objective that the opponent isn't going to be able to reach fast. As for downsides, he is locked to a Latok, which is quite a big disadvantage. It's not one of the stronger Craftworlds overall. I'd say that he is kind of limited use if there aren't any good characters exposed for him to hunt. That sniper rifle, even with the mortal wounds, isn't going to be super efficient against most other targets, and he doesn't really support any other units with any buffs or outside utility. Overall not bad. If he does have characters to hunt, then he'll be very useful, but I'd rate him a 6 out of 10 overall. Lastly, for the HQ section, we have the Spirit Seer, a 75-point seer. You get either 1 power from the Warlock Discipline or Fortune, so a bit of helpful psychic, but perhaps the main draw is reroll 1s to wound for nearby core Wraith units. If he wants to, then he can project those rerolls onto a unit much further away for 1 CP, though I'm not sure it's the most efficient use of CP personally. As for downsides, the Warlocks are more efficient if you just want Warlock powers. It's 40 points for one of those as opposed to 75 points for one of these. You would need to both be getting good value out of the Warlock power or the Fortune one, and then also supporting a fairly hefty amount of Wraith units, maybe a big block of Wraith Blades, or perhaps something like a trio of Wraith Lords. Unfortunately, I'd say that while both of those units are usable enough, I wouldn't say that they're enormously standout right now. I'd rank this guy as a 6 out of 10 overall. Fine enough if you are using Wraith units, but even then I wouldn't say that is auto-include compared with Farseers or Warlocks. Finally, for the Craftworld units, I thought we'd just spin quickly through the Forge World units, all of these datasheets available in the Imperial Armour Compendium. We've already talked about Irilith in the Phoenix Lord section, but here are the rest. Most of them aren't really outstanding or top choices for the Codex, I think, but a few are pretty usable. First up, we've got the Shadow Spectres, Irilith's Auspex, and they're 26 points per model. I'm afraid I would rank them at least fairly underwhelming. They do have okay general purpose firepower, but are just very pricey at 26 points. Just not particularly efficient damage dealers in my opinion. I'd rather have things like mass shurikens from Dire Avengers, or the more mixed threat of shooting and combat from Shining Spears. Even with -1 to hit, they're very fragile for 26 points. Hornets at 80 points base, a bit more usable I think, very fast even for Eldar. They get a -1 to hit as light vehicles, and they have quite a few viable heavy weapon options, maybe star cannons or bright lances being particularly interesting. If you want something that's halfway between a Viper and a Warwalker that's fast and -1 to hit, then these guys might be worth paying the premium for. The Nightwing is an Eldar flyer for 220 points, probably worse than the Codex planes I think. It packs a couple of shuriken cannons plus lances. The Lynx is an Eldar heavy tank for 220 points. It has a fairly general purpose strength 9 AP3 shot that goes out to a long range, and okay durability with 16 wounds and a 5+ invul. The Warp Hunter's a bit more of a close range grav tank, fairly usable scary damage, particularly if you're in its flamer type range. Unfortunately, it does just need to get really quite close to deliver that damage, and then like the other Eldar grav tanks, it's not all that hard to remove with any kind of anti-tank gun. The Wraithseer I think is a pretty interesting choice, 130 points base for essentially a Wraith Lord that can cast a psychic power, and has a powerful Ghost Spear and a 5+ invul save. Quite interesting that it can mount a mobile D cannon as well, which could be good for slogging out a bit of heavy artillery fire as it moves up the board. It isn't core though, unlike the other Wraith Lords. Finally, we've got the Eldar Super Heavies. The Cobra's a big 450 points, a scary gun but just doesn't really do enough for its cost. As with the other Lords of War, it'll have issues with terrain. The Phantom and Revenant Titans are more really big fun models for Apocalypse type games. The Revenant is 1500 points and the Phantom 3000. Very fast moving and can punch pretty hard both at range and in combat, but in any sort of normal size game of 40k you're either not going to be able to field them, or they're going to eat up so much of your army that you don't have enough left to support. The Scorpion I think is maybe a bit more of a general purpose super heavy. 12 shots at strength 12, AP4 and damage 3 is going to stack hurt at whatever it shoots at least it can deal all of that at long range. Still not super awesome though for 500 points, and the fact that it's not doing much else though. Finally we've got the Scathach Wraith Knight for 325 points base. Interesting different war gear choices to the standard one, but overall since the tune up to the gear that the normal Wraith Knight got, I do think it is still probably weaker overall. Generally out of these, I think for the Forge World choices, I'd be most looking at Hornets, the Lynx, the Wraithseer, and maybe Irilith out of the Phoenix Lords. So with Forge World done, I think that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Eldar review. As I said, I'll hope to cover things like Ynnari and Harlequins in their own videos given time. As always, if you think that I've missed anything important for these units, or you think that I've rated anything too high or too low, please let me know down in the comments. Always cool to get new insights about cool 40k units. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, I will try and cover most of the armies in a similar fashion to this, plus I'm sure we'll have some other interesting stuff for the Eldar in the future. And lastly, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to quickly mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.